Good day. As the situation in Afghanistan remains the major focus, the rest of the world continues on its course. Thus, we learn today that President Erdogan of Turkey is in advanced negotiations with the Russians to buy a second batch of S-400 air defense missiles. Apparently, these negotiations have been underway for some time and have been going on behind the scenes without much report or discussion, presumably to avoid provoking a strong reaction from the United States. But we also learned that these negotiations are almost now at the point of fruition and that documents are being prepared and a contract is about to be signed. That is an important development, one which shows that Erdogan, under pressure from both the United States and Russia, though in radically different ways, and with difficult relations with Europe, is continuing with the policy of rapprochement with Russia, which he has erratically and whimsically, and sometimes in contradictory ways, followed ever since the coup that failed against him in 2016. And secondly, we have a very interesting visit by Angela Merkel, the outgoing Chancellor of Germany, to Moscow and Kiev. In Moscow, she met with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The two of them held a joint press conference. They disagreed ever so politely on just about every topic, but they exchanged warm words. And despite the fact that, as is fairly well known, in private they dislike each other, in public they managed to give the impression that they were the best of friends. By the way, I should say that this appearance of friendship and goodwill that Merkel and Putin managed to put on, this show, if you like, to my mind, is a sign of their very high professionalism as diplomats. In diplomacy, good manners, an appearance of courtesy are something one should always strive for, and one should never, at any point, in my opinion, show or expose one's anger with the person one is speaking to. The French Foreign Minister Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister, and by most accounts a diplomat of genius, once put it very well. When asked what qualities it was important for a diplomat to have, he said, a lack of zeal. So there we go. Merkel in Moscow, Erdogan negotiating with the Russians. But lest we think that everything revolves around the Russians, Merkel also, of course, went to Kiev, where she met with Zelensky and gave Zelensky and the Ukrainians a not so subtle hint, or if you like, warning, that the days of gas transit from Russia to Ukraine are almost over, and that this business that the Ukrainians have had, where they pocket large amounts of money from the Russians in transit fees, is coming to an end. To be precise, Merkel said that she wants to see the transit of natural gas from Russia across Ukraine continue after 2024, when the present contract is due to end. But it would seem that she cannot guarantee it. And she told the Ukrainians that with the shift away from fossil fuels, Europe's need for natural gas anyway is going to decline in the future. The last point I take principally, by the way, as Merkel trying to sugar the pill to the Ukrainians, telling them in not so many words that they're not needed anymore, and that if the gas trade continues, which, by the way, I predict it will not transit Ukraine for much longer. Putin, by the way, and for his part, has said that he's not sure whether there is enough demand for gas in Europe to justify transit across Ukraine. And he's also made it clear that as far as he's concerned, that he has no objection to doing it. It is absolutely not something which comes anywhere close to being on his list of priorities. So there we see two important leaders, Erdogan and Merkel, doing things which have no connection to Afghanistan. And of course, in both cases, Putin is in some way involved. He, of course, met with Merkel and he has regular contacts with Erdogan. And it's now a certainty that the S-400, this renewed or further S-400 sale, has been a topic of discussion between the two of them for some time. But of course, it is Afghanistan that remains the centre of world attention. And in fact, it is also Afghanistan that is making the political weather in various Western capitals, in the United States, but also in Britain and in some of the European states, also, especially apart from Britain, Germany. But it is Britain that I'm going to focus on simply because, as well as being my own country, we've now had a long article in the Daily Mail newspaper from one of the authors of this debacle, or so it seems to me, Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, who in October 2001 rallied the Labour Party conference to the cause of liberating Afghanistan from the Taliban, and who once pledged to George W. Bush, from whom, by the way, we are hearing remarkably little, that he would be with America all the way and forever, however long and however hard the road turned out to be. So what does Tony Blair, neocon in chief, liberal interventionist in chief, the person who can argue with some conviction that he is the person who invented the concept of R2P, responsibility to protect, not perhaps as an academic concept, but as a matter of politics and policy, as a result of a speech he gave in 1999 in Chicago. What does Tony Blair have to say about this whole situation? Well, his article in the Daily Mail was a long screed against the Americans and against the current political class, dressed up, as is always the way with Blair, in elegant language and beautifully formed sentences and carefully chosen words. And it was also a screed full of all the usual cliches and bromides that one has come to expect, I'm sorry to say, from people like him. But there was one thing, or rather two things about this long article, which stood out for me. And I can illustrate the first by going right to the beginning of this article, to the words he uses when he discusses the kind of policies that Britain and the United States has followed. He uses words like this: "We didn't need to do it. We chose to do it. We did it in obedience to an imbecilic political slogan about ending the forever wars, as if our engagement in 2021 was remotely comparable to our commitment 20 or even 10 years ago, in circumstances in which troop numbers have declined to a minimum and no Allied soldier had lost their life in combat for 18 months. We did it in the knowledge that though worse than imperfect and though immensely fragile, there were real gains over the past 20 years. We withdrew because our politics seemed to demand it. And that's the worry of our allies and the source of rejoicing in those who wish us ill." And it goes on like that. Now, of course, the words in those sentences that have perhaps justifiably attracted the most attention was the words about "we did it in obedience to" an imbecilic political slogan about ending the forever wars. Now that, as many people have pointed out, is clearly a swipe at President Biden of the United States, who in that speech he made a week ago, on Monday last week, spoke about the need for the United States to stop the process of democracy promotion and end the forever wars. And Blair says that is an imbecilic slogan, an imbecilic political slogan. In other words, he is saying that the President of the United States, Joe Biden, has been uttering imbecilities. And of course, and it's an obvious step from that, and one which many people are taking, to say that Tony Blair is calling Joe Biden an imbecile. Well, he would deny it, but the words are there, they're in his article, and they speak for themselves. But for me, actually, there is another word other than imbecilic, which I find even more revealing about the mindset of Tony Blair and the people like him, especially in Britain. He speaks continuously, for example, of we. We didn't need to do it. We chose to do it. We did it in obedience to an imbecilic slogan. We did it in the knowledge that though worse than imperfect and though immensely fragile, there were real gains over the past 20 years. Who precisely is this we? I mean, is it Britain? Is it the United States? Is it the West? Is it the British people? Is it the American people? What right does Tony Blair have to use the word we? I mean, after all, he is not the British Prime Minister anymore. He ceased to be that 14 years ago. And he is a private citizen of Britain and has never been, in any way, a holder of any kind of elected office in the United States. So who is this we that he is constantly harping on about? Well, it's quite clear that he actually means the United States and Britain. And to my mind, this is, in fact, an indicator of the fundamental fallacy, the absurd mistake that the British establishment, of which, to be very clear, Tony Blair is a fully paid up member, repeatedly and continuously makes. Because they think that they can speak for the United States, even though the United States is a different country, far mightier than their own, and one which, after all, has a right to pursue its own policies. But of course, that's not what the British want to hear. And we understand why when we go further into Blair's article and we see what he has to say about the situation, the current condition of the United States and also of Britain. He says the following: intervention requires commitment and not time limited by political timetables, but by obedience to goals. For Britain and the US, these questions are acute. The absence of consensus and collaboration and the deep politicization of foreign policy and security issues is visibly atrophying American power. Well, that's what he has to say about the United States. Let's do what nobody ever does with Tony Blair's speeches and actually unpack that. Let's parse it and see exactly what he's saying. He says intervention requires commitment, but that this intervention, this commitment, cannot be time limited by political timetables. Well, what does that mean? It in effect means the abolition of politics from the conduct of foreign policy. In other words, the United States, though nominally a democracy, is not supposed to subject its foreign policies to the usual controls that one expects to see in a democracy over all areas of policy, both domestic and foreign. In other words, what he wants to see, what Tony Blair wants to see, is the United States executing foreign policy which is controlled and decided and determined by a technocratic elite, people presumably like he imagines himself, people who are able to set out long-term goals which they commit everyone else to, but which no one else has any right to object to or argue with. And in effect, what Blair is also saying in that paragraph is that democracy and long-term goals are really incompatible, and that this pursuit of democracy in the United States and in other countries is somehow visibly atrophying American power. I have to say, I found that a straightforwardly sinister paragraph. And again, it's striking that nobody that I know picks up on Blair's thinking on this sort of issue. But then you go on and you come to the next paragraph where he talks about Britain. And for Britain, out of the EU and suffering the end of the Afghan mission by our greatest ally with little or no consultation, we have serious reflection to do. We don't see it yet, but we are at risk of relegation to the second division of global powers. Maybe we don't mind, but we should at least take the decision deliberately. Now, consider 3 points. Britain out of the EU. So presumably Britain staying in the EU would have somehow made a difference, at least a difference perhaps to the events in Afghanistan. Perhaps a Britain that had been a member of the EU would have been able, to change the situation in Afghanistan, to prevent the American withdrawal from that country, or to prevent the Taliban taking power there. Well, how precisely? How would Britain, being in the EU, have made the slightest difference? Why add the EU into this discussion? The EU is irrelevant. First of all, Afghanistan was never an EU project anyway. It was an American and a British and a NATO project. But why then bring in the EU? Well, I'm going to come to the reason in a moment, but let's go on with this paragraph. Britain suffering the end of the Afghanistan mission by our greatest ally with little or no consultation. Well, this is again a Blairite paragraph, a sentence, if ever there was one. What exactly is Britain suffering? Is it suffering the end of its Afghan mission? In other words, is Britain suffering from the fact that a war in Afghanistan has ended? How is Britain suffering from the fact that that war in Afghanistan is ending? What exactly does that mean, this suffering that Blair is talking about, if that is what he means in this sentence? Or is it suffering from the fact that our greatest ally, that is to say the United States, decided to end the war in Afghanistan with little or no consultation of Britain? Is that what we need to be suffering over? Is that what ought to be causing us concerns? Well, Blair doesn't make it at all clear, but I'm going to say straight away that talk of suffering in this situation is wholly and completely misplaced. If Britain is suffering, well, what are the people of Afghanistan, the victims of this war, which he and George W. Bush inflicted on them way back in 2001, what is it that they are experiencing? I think words should be used carefully and chosen carefully, and I personally find use by Blair of that word suffering deeply offensive and extremely objectionable. But then we come to the key sentence, or rather two sentences, in the whole long article, the two sentences which, to my mind, encapsulate not just Blair's thinking, but the thinking of the entire British political elite. We don't see it yet, but we are at risk of relegation to the second division of global powers. Maybe we don't mind, but we should at least take the decision deliberately. Now, that implies that being a first division power, presumably a great power, is a question of choice. A country supposedly chooses to be a great power or chooses not to be a great power. Well, actually, that is completely and utterly absurd. As Blair, of course, knows, being a great power is not a question of choice. It is a question of having power, having the power, a great enough power, to be able to act like a great power. And Britain has not been in that position for many years. Britain has never been in a position to exert power independently around the world like a great power can do since at least the 1950s, when the Suez Adventure of 1956 was arguably the last occasion when the British tried to act independently of the United States, and when they found themselves brought down to earth by the United States with a thump. In reality, if you have to look back to years, the last years, when Britain really was a great power and really did act like a great power, then you have to go back to the first years of the Second World War and the last years of the peace which preceded it. The period from roughly 1938 to 1942, dominated by the personality of Winston Churchill, when the British really were making decisions on their own and were making decisions which shaped history. I should say that one of the reasons for the British fixation with those particular years, why there are so many stories and histories and books and plays and films and articles about those years preceding and at the beginning of the Second World War, and why the personality of Winston Churchill continues to exert so much fascination for the British. It is precisely because those were the years, and he was the statesman who took the decisions which were the last decisions that Britain ever made as a great power. So, in practical, in real terms, Britain has been a second division state, at least since the 1950s, arguably even earlier than that, and certainly it has not been and cannot pretend to be today a great power by itself in any shape or form. So why does Blair then say that Britain is at risk of relegation to the second division of global powers, when, as I said, it actually does belong in terms of its own power to the second division of global powers? Well, we come back to those earlier paragraphs and that repeated use of the word we. Because what Blair is basically saying, the mindset and the world he expresses, is that in international relations, Britain and the United States are all but one. And more importantly, it is British leaders, people like him, who should at times be in the driving seat as they try to use the vastly greater power of the United States to shape their objectives. In other words, Britain, despite the fact that it lacks the resources, the power to be a great power, can masquerade as a great power by floating on the wave of the United States, the power of the United States. And what is causing Blair so much alarm, the reason why he thinks that Britain is at risk of relegation to the second division of global powers, is because he fears that American power is atrophying because of an excess of democracy, it would seem, in the United States, which means that the Americans are no longer willing, as presumably they once were, to do what the British tell them or to work with the British, in harness with the British on all the various adventures that the British want to follow, standing up to the Russians, for example, in Eastern Europe and all that. Now, I have to say, that is an extraordinarily false and manipulative way of thinking. The idea that Britain can somehow manipulate the United States to its end is immoral and offensive, and sooner or later it is bound to be exposed and called out. The United States, of course, and in reality, has always made its own decisions. And this pretense that the British have, this foolish idea that it is they who can somehow, sometimes, push themselves into the driving seat in this relationship, all that it has actually done is that it has meant that the British are swept along in America's coattails, pretending to themselves that American enterprises are somehow joint enterprises and they have some sort of word or sway in them. But regardless, whether it is the United States, which is the dominant partner in the relationship, which it obviously is, or whether it is Britain, as it appears to be in Blair's fantasies, either way, this is a manipulative and dishonest relationship which Blair is outlining, and one which, as he admits in the previous paragraph, is one which can only function in the United States if politics there is abolished and the United States ceases to be a democratic republic. Well, all I can say is that this is dangerous, foolish, and reckless talk, but it explains to me so much of the anger that one is seeing in Britain on the part of the political class at the moment. Since, to their horror and astonishment, the Americans have now made a decision to quit Afghanistan in a way that the British did not like and were not consulted about, exposing in a way that the British are shocked and alarmed by the reality that that in this relationship, in this partnership, it is America that holds all the power, that Britain actually has very little, and that Britain in truth is that second division state, which Blair says he is so worried and afraid it may become. The British, in other words, have just received a lesson in the reality of power, and they don't like it at all, just as they don't like the fact that the United States no longer says it wants to be involved in democracy promotion, where for the British, the slogan of democracy promotion is precisely what gives them, as they believe, that moral leverage over the United States, which has enabled them for so long to pretend to be that which they are not, which is a great power. Anyway, there we are. The British have now learnt that lesson, and they're being taught a further lesson by no less an organisation like the Taliban. Because over the last few hours, the British have been desperately lobbying the United States to extend the 31st of August deadline for the evacuation from Kabul airport. There's been rumours floating all over the British media that Boris Johnson wants to call Joe Biden in order to try to persuade Joe Biden to keep the US troops in Kabul airport beyond 31st August. We don't know what Joe Biden would say in response to that kind of request, but the Taliban have already ruled it out. In fact, they're even saying that it is a red line and that though people are free to leave Afghanistan whenever they wish, even after the US and British and German troops at the airport have left, the fact remains that they are not prepared to let those troops stay beyond the August 31st deadline, which was previously agreed between them and the United States, and that is a red line for them. And, of course, the British, faced apparently by the determination of the Taliban to have all foreign troops out of their country and by the unwillingness of the United States to keep their troops in Kabul airport, are going to have to pull out on the 31st of August also. As I said, it is power ultimately that decides. It's not the fantasies of people like Tony Blair. The problem is these fantasies seem to be shared by far too many people in Britain, in the British political class, the government class, the opposition, and in the media. As I'm making this programme, there continue to be endless criticisms of Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, and Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, for the fact that they were both either about to go on holiday or were on holiday when the Taliban took over Kabul. There's also been endless criticisms of Dominic Raab because he failed to telephone the Afghan foreign minister at a time when the Afghan foreign minister and the Afghan government were negotiating some form of transitional power arrangement. The reality is whether Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab had stayed on their holiday and continued with their holidays or not, or had been chained to their desks, it wouldn't have made the blindest bit of difference. Kabul would have fallen, the Taliban would have won, things would have turned out in exactly the way that they have. That is an argument, again, of people who cannot accept or understand the fact that Britain is not the great power that they want it to be and ceased to be that long ago. Now, I'm going to finish this programme, and I'm sorry if I made several programmes now about Britain, but as I said, it is my own country. I'm going to say something else. As I said previously, whether one is a great power or not is not a matter of choice. It is a matter of power, or if you prefer, of resources. But there is nothing unworthy in not being a great power. In fact, countries which are not great powers do very well for themselves. They can achieve very high standards of living for their peoples, higher than that in Britain. If you go to countries like Germany, which doesn't think of itself as a great power, or even a place like Singapore, for example, they can have happy, contented societies, and they can work and carry out active diplomacy and command, by the way, a great deal of influence. And in fact, if you think about it, if you take a step back and go back to the points that I made at the start of this program about Erdogan talking to the Russians about an S-400 missile deal and Merkel visiting Moscow and Kiev, you see how two countries, Turkey and Germany, which Blair would not say were great powers, are able to exert far more influence than Britain, this phony, masquerading great power, actually does. And the reason is because, especially in the case of the Germans, the fact that they have no illusions that they are a great power gives them freedom. They're able to go to Moscow and talk to the Russians and sign deals with the Russians and build pipelines with the Russians and invest in Russia and receive Russian investment in return and do trade and dealings with Russia, which increases prosperity in Germany itself. The British cut themselves off from those sort of options precisely because they still stick with this fantasy that they can be a great power by hitching themselves to the chariot of the United States. Well, this is a dismal policy, the policy that Blair and the political class would have us follow in Britain, one which loses us money, treasure, the lives of our young men, the political energy which ought to be focused on other things, and which brings us nothing but humiliation and shame. Let us put it behind us. Let us put people like Blair once and for all behind us. It is extraordinary. It is bizarre that Blair, of all people, should be allowed to pronounce on these sort of matters. And given the disasters that he has led us repeatedly into, let us put all of that behind us and concentrate on that hard work we have to do in Britain today to try to make this country a place, the place that it can be and which most British people would want it to be. Well, thank you for joining me today in this program. I hope you will join me again in future programs on this channel, and please also check out our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video, and please also check us up on our other platforms, BitChute, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU, and of course Locals, where we have a thriving community and where I've just done my first dry run on doing various things which I'm about to launch shortly. And also, please, if you want to support this channel, go to our shop, buy the amazing things you will find there, our famous Duran hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest, and also support us via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And if you like this program, please remember to tick the like button to this video, and please also check your subscription to this channel. And thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.